You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor of Renew Economy, editor-in-chief of Renew Economy, been recently promoted, and founder and editor of the EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And joining me in one of the last Energy Insiders podcasts of this autumn season is David Leach from ITK. David, I trust you are well and rugging up for the bout of cold weather that we've got.
Giles, yes, we finally got some cold weather, but since I'm heading off to China in a little while, it'll probably be a bit warmer, but let's not talk about that. We've got a great interview today about the next hot topic that I think we'll be talking about more and more as the next couple of years go on.
Yes, data centres. Are they good or bad for the grid? Are they good or bad for the country, the economy, the world? We're going to focus on the grid question. So we have Keith Middleton from
the Middleton Group, which is now part of the Fife Group of our engineering companies. And as well, let Keith speak for himself, because as far as I'm concerned, he's got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. Thanks very much, Keith, for joining the Energy Insiders podcast. You're the CEO of the Fife Group, of the Middleton Group, self-autonomous, and which has just merged, I believe, with the Fife Group, and you have a background as a power engineer and I guess an overall advisor on power engineering. Is that correct?
Yeah, look, thank you, David and Giles, for having me on the Energy Insiders today. Yep, so I was the founder and managing director of Middleton Group Engineering, a specialist power systems consulting, Australian-based, and we merged with the Fife Group approximately 10 months ago now. So now I lead the power and electrification capability within the Fife Group in Australia.
And so I had the pleasure of hearing your brief presentation at the excellent NHA Responsible BESS seminar, and I guess 2 points came through to me from what you said there. And I guess the first one was that you're working on grid connection studies for about 3 gigawatts of data centres at the moment. Is that correct?
Yeah, David, the Fife team, we've got approximately 8 gigawatts of data centres in our broader portfolio at various stages of development, and the bulk of those are in New South Wales, Victoria, and some emerging projects in South Australia. What I was referring to in my presentation, David, and I guess it's been a real tidal wave of let's call it AI investment coming into Australia. It is a great place to invest for hyperscalers and data centres here. We've got good, strong power networks, a good regulatory regime, and good support from government, we believe, good access to land, and very, very strong fibre connectivity to our core markets of Asia and the USA. So it is a great place to build data centres here. There are some restrictions, and with regards to the 3 gigawatts that I talked about in my presentation at NHA BESS Summit a few weeks ago, David, where it's all about getting those hyperscale data centre connections through the AEMO VicGrid, let's call it the 534 power connections process. And the reason why that's really critical to us and the industry, the data centre industry, is no power, no project. So these data centres, they're typically above 500 megawatts to justify a connection to the power transmission network at 220 kV and above. And we've been working very closely with AEMO and VicGrid to secure those connections. And once those connections are secured, our investors will have ticked one of the final boxes to invest and build. And I think it'll send a message to the market that Australia is open for business for hyperscale data centres.
And so, this is speculative and outside what you would probably want to comment on. But if I just asked you as a betting person, which I'm sure you're not, what's of that 3 gigawatts how much do you think it'll all get built?
David, look, I'm an engineer, so I'm typically pretty conservative. I'm not a betting person, but I do have a view, and I think the reality is that I would say that the amount of applications for power in Australia is completely oversubscribing what's actually available in the grid to connect and provide capacity or power to, probably by 4 to 5 times. I was talking to somebody in New South Wales and the TNSP Transgrid up there. At the moment, they're looking at a 14 gigawatt tidal wave of applications for data centres into a grid that probably has 4 to 5 gigawatts of capacity. So it is oversubscribed. Which ones get through and actually secure connections remains to be seen. We've got a lot of speculative players out there who are just taking the opportunity, and a number of very mature, experienced data centre developers who have got a good, clear strategy. So to answer your question specifically about how many will get connected, it'll be limited by grid capacity and other factors, other non-power factors. So of my 3, we're optimistic we'll get them all through, because they're all for, let's call it, investors and developers who are experienced and committed and have done it before, which is what I believe AEMO are looking for when they're looking at who's coming in and who's credible and who's not.
Now, the other side of it, and I'll hand over to Giles in a sec, because this is a new business and, really at the scale that we're talking about. So there's such a lot of things to think about. But at your present, and I've got some other issues, but at the presentation, you mentioned that AEMO has concerns about how data centres will behave on the grid, and in particular, the worry that they connect and disconnect gracefully, if I can put it that way, so we don't get sudden changes in demand. That can cause system instability. And you were suggesting various technologies that data centers could co-locate that would assist that process. And I think you said that the batteries came out on top in your studies there.
Yeah, no, certainly, David. Look, I guess AEMO and Vicgrid and the other network planners in Australia are rapidly coming up to speed as to how they're going to keep the lights on, and given the likely quantity and size of connections of these data centres. These data centres, they are powered by power electronics or inverter-based loads, as AEMO classifies them, and they can have a negative impact on the grid if they're not carefully managed. So AEMO recently put out to consultation a rule change, which is going to impose on these data centres that are connecting to comply with certain requirements in order to be granted connection, and it's all about protecting grid stability and grid availability for our community. And those requirements broadly talk about that the primary concern is what we call fault ride-through, which is the ability of the data centres to stay connected to the grid and hold on to the grid during a network or grid disturbance. What we don't want is a cascading disconnection of multiple data centres that will all disconnect to protect themselves, and they'll switch across to their diesel generators and UPSs and whatnot. So it's all about basically making sure we don't drop load rapidly in bulk, which could destabilise the grid. And it's also about how we ensure that when the grid does recover after a disturbance, that the power demand from a data centre can rapidly reconnect or rapidly reapply to ensure we're matching the generation connected to the grid needs to match the load, and we need to make sure that load reconnects so we don't end up with too much generation connected causing instability. There's a few other requirements in there that are all wrapped into the rule change that is currently about to be brought into effect. In terms of the technologies we spoke about at the data centre conference, we've been almost planning for some of the additional technologies that may be required in some locations to make sure our customers can secure connection. The data centres by themselves may not fully comply. They might need help. And so we've been doing some studies on behalf of some of our customers on what other technological solutions could be co-located with a data centre to help with some of those fault ride-through compliance type matters, as well as helping with, let's call it the supply of green electrons that are also needed. And we did a study on a number of technologies, and we shortlisted those down to what could grid forming BESS do to secure connections for data centres, what could synchronous condensers, STATCOMs and other technologies. And when we looked at the performance of all of those technologies for two specific case studies, one was a transmission-connected 1,000 megawatt data centre, and one was a 200 megawatt distribution-connected data centres. The BESS was the best performing across the criteria of fault ride through, active power recovery, system strength benefits, the ability to mitigate, let's call it NSP-driven load curtailment events, and also the ability of the BESS to actually provide some benefit from a revenue generation perspective, operating alongside an NEM-connected generation, renewable energy generator like a wind farm or a solar farm, etc. So that was where we landed. Now, of course, those were based on those two case studies, and every single project is different. And some data centers won't need support; they'll.
Yeah. Let's dot the I's and cross the T's. But I just want to get the main guts of it here.
So does that mean that basically those big data centers that you're putting forward, the 3 gigawatts, they'll probably come with their own big batteries as part of that connection plan?
Well, they in certain locations, I believe that is part of the solution, Giles. Not in all cases, but what we are seeing, what I would call it a number of focal points for multiple data centres emerging across the NEM in Victoria and New South Wales, and we're seeing multiple gigawatt scale data centres all connecting into similar terminal stations, which don't exist yet. Terminal stations to be built, and some that do. And around those nodes, with that concentration, it's my view that BESS have a key role to play at those nodes to help with grid stability.
So can I just clarify a couple of things then? So because they need approval from AEMO to connect to the grid, does that mean that whether they need a big battery to come with them, or whether they can rely on a common battery or a stable part of the grid, they won't be allowed to connect unless the AEMO is satisfied that the grid will be protected in the event of some sort of incident? So
yeah, that 100%. Yeah, the NER 534A process that connecting parties, large loads need to go through. It's rigorous, and it's all about proving to, I guess, AEMO and VicGrid satisfaction, if we're in Victoria, for example, that the data centres will not create instability on the grid.
And then the question about green electrons, which you just mentioned there. My understanding is there is a wish by authorities that they are powered by green electrons. I'm not too sure if that's an enforceable undertaking. Can you just clarify that? And do your data centres that you've been working on plan to bring their own green electrons, or just strike PPAs with existing facilities?
Oh, look, I think what's driving their driving towards green electrons today is really just embedded in what our Australia's renewable energy targets are, and that's almost like a baseline minimum expectation. But the other key thing is, how do we make sure that these data centres are not pushing up power prices or putting extra demand on the network without adequate generation being provided. So the theory really is that, and I think where this kind of goes is that for hyperscale data centers or large capacity loads that are connecting, they really need to have an energy strategy as part of their development of their project, which is going to provide a level of comfort and reassurance to the regulators, whoever they are. This is still emerging, and I'd like to talk about that separately, that we do actually have a solution for it.
Because presumably some of these data centers actually want to get built quite quickly, probably quicker than any new wind, solar, or battery storage or hybrids can be built. So, and
if they get built at all, they'll be built faster than some of these wind farms. But go on.
Well, that's right, yeah. And we keep on reading and we keep on reporting about some of these plans for some of these data centers to come with gas-fired generators. Some of them specifically for that project, and others like Energy Australia's increased Maroolin facility just on the assumption that they will be needed to support those data centers. So I'm just trying to sort of work out, because there's a lot of concern about this. Do data centers mean we're going to be burning more fossil fuels, or can data centers be that actually missing link to sort of accelerate that transition to green energy and provide the PPAs which some of these projects haven't had?
Well, Giles, that's my belief. I mean, the customers we're working with, the data center customers we're working with, they've got to often have their own, I guess, let's call it policies about green electrons for their loads, for their data centers. And at the same time, they also realise that if they can't build social licence as they try to secure projects in Australia through managing power prices and not impacting power prices and not impacting on our energy transition, this is bad for the industry. So the customers we've been working with have been very proactive to engage with renewable energy developers early to start to talk about an energy strategy to make sure they have the green electrons they need when they need them. David, you made a comment about can we build wind farms and solar farms and BESS fast enough to to meet the demand of a data center. That is a challenge. I'm going to be honest and say there are some things holding our energy transition back in Australia, which means it's slowing us down from building what we know we need to build. And that's definitely something I think that our policymakers and regulators have a role to play to help our industry to make sure that we're building data center capacity at a rate which is in line with our ability to build clean generation.
Keith, there's a couple of other points I want to touch on, and one of them is the backup generation, which is when I look at all the diesel sets that are going to be concentrated around Eastern Creek in Sydney, I kind of ask questions. But you mentioned yourself about the terminal stations, and the first thing I think about is that it's the connection capacity, as you mentioned. When I just looked around Eastern Creek, and I want to thank RenewMap for letting me look at their map here, and I see that there's already like 800 megawatts of data centres connected to what is it, the Western Sydney link of Transgrid through Endeavour, and there's another 800 megawatts that will use up all that terminal capacity and will require the Sydney South reinforcing ring, I believe. You can tell me if I've got this wrong. I'm a financial analyst. And then the question emerges is who's responsible for the capex of these new transmission stations?
Look, the significant investment in brand new terminal stations to connect these data centres, our customers are largely proactively funding this infrastructure. So essentially, the concept is that if my customers are looking for new power assets to connect, then they're willing to fund those, and they're required to fund those. And the idea is that these costs should not be passed through to just the general consumers.
And good. Well, that sounds great because I'm not sure whether it always works out like that, but I don't really care in the sense, and there is a lot to say about it. It also seems to me that so far what I've seen, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I really don't know anything about it, but the data centres are tending to cluster around particular terminal stations. And so this immediately makes me think of, let's talk about this 99, I think there's a standard 4 or something that says they have to have 99.94 or 96% uptime. And therefore, every data center has to have its own backup diesel genset, more or less. Firstly, is that correct?
Yeah. So the goal for the bulk of our data center customers is the 5 nines, 99.999% reliability to the rack or the server, if you like. And historically, this has required these data centers to have their own completely separate backup diesel generators on site, ready to go if ever we lose power. So that's the standard design. It's been how let's call it the data center industry has developed over decades. What's changed though that I think presents an opportunity to how we think about backup diesel generation on site is we're now connecting these hyperscale data centers to the transmission network at 220, 330, 500, etc. And fundamentally, those networks are significantly more reliable than the distribution networks that the smaller data centers were connected to. So now you've moved up to a much more reliable, a stronger network. What we've found for our own studies is when you look into some of those high voltage transmission bus bars that you're connecting into, we're very, very close to 5 nines in terms of the reliability of the grid at that point in time. So the question follows, if I'm very, very close to 5 nines where I'm connecting a transmission, which is different from connecting a distribution, then do I still need the same level of diesel generation backup? And this is an opportunity, I think, that the industry hasn't quite solved yet. But definitely, I think there's a significant opportunity to reduce that unnecessary capex and unnecessary environmental impact.
Have I missed something? But with all the batteries and the performance of the batteries and their capabilities, I just can't believe that we're even thinking that we need diesel genset backup. I just thought a couple of batteries do that.
Giles, I think the standard when I read it, and again, specifies that you have to have 4 days worth of backup. and so that you've got to.
Was that right?
You've got to store all that diesel on site for the one time in 5 years that it might occur.
Well, you might even say, David, it might be one time in 20 years when you connect a transmission. So it strengthens your argument that is there another way? And you're right, you can't. 4 days worth of battery backup is not practical on these sites. But is there an intermediate position where, for example, with these hyperscale loads, we're all learning a lot about how these data centers train and use energy. But if we did have one of those black swan events where we do lose power for a day or 2 days, this is a 1 in 20 year event, then do we really need 4 days of 100% backup diesel generator on that site, or can we have some kind of a blend of BESS with backup generators, and also move workload to another part of the grid where the power is stable? So there's definitely opportunity in there to rethink how we use a BESS with the data center, with the grid, and with hopefully less diesel generators in the future.
It also made me think about a campus, where all the data centers were connected to the terminal station and had the one, longer term backup, which might be a gas generator or something like that, if you could find the right spot. And all the data centers at the moment want to locate in the capital cities, but when you're running a gigawatts worth of data center, energy is a much bigger component of the total cost. Wouldn't there be a case for locating them out where the actual generation is, or something like that?
Yeah, maybe, David, I'll talk about gas powered generation working with data centers in a second, and maybe separately from how we can move these things from where they're traditionally located. Certainly, gas powered generation does have an absolute role in the case of bridge to grid. So often we want to get these data centers working before the full capacity in the grid arrives, and how can a gas powered generation plant where gas is available provide that bridge to grid? That's something which we've been looking at with a number of our customers, which has merit, and it's certainly been used overseas. So that's number one. Obviously, you need plentiful supply of gas, and there is quite a long lead time on gas powered generation turbine equipment currently. So that's one thing. So yes, that definitely has a future in terms of moving them from the cities. My view, based upon the experience that my team and I have had, is the hands down preference at the moment is to locate these data centers where the power is, where latency is good access to fiber optic networks that are fast. That's what the customers need from these AI, these data centers. But what's emerging for us is that as these data centers are doing different things, particularly around AI training, and latency requirements are becoming less critical, there really is, I think, an obvious pathway for certain types of data centers to move themselves to areas where land is more plentiful, power exists, and it can actually be of benefit for local communities, and that could be into some of the red zones that we're seeing emerge across the states, and also close to cities where they could benefit. So I 100% think that this has legs. The industry is relatively conservative, and they'll change when we need to change. At the moment, the focus is still primarily on Melbourne and Sydney.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, there's been some renewable developers who've been sort of actively pushing the idea that, bring a data center here and we can get our wind or solar farms built and grid constraints relieved. And what do you make of? I mean, it's probably hard for you to sort of comment on another commercial operation, but Twiggy Forrest has been touting the construction of a 200 megawatt sort of green mini grid for such things, data center interests. So he's committed to spending $1 billion building one. Will the data centers come? And I guess Intercontinental Energy, which has got grand plans still for green ammonia and things like that, are also looking at the data center as an add-on, as a lucrative and important add-on. So will they go to the Pilbara?
Well, look, I think there's a number of developers and investors trying to develop projects that's going to lure in this investment, Giles, and I think it's fantastic to see the creativity in the renewable energy industry around how to attract them. I think that's fantastic. And exactly where they decide to go is yet to be seen. But there are definite benefits for placing large loads like data centers with renewable energy behind the meter. I think there are a lot of benefits, and so it remains to be seen exactly where the market will go. Again, my expertise is power systems engineering and grid. And I can't really speak on behalf of the let's call it the compute clients, but it'll be an interesting way to see what happens.
The compute clients are though very interesting. Again, when I looked at it, it seemed to me that we talk about the difficulty of getting the energy, the difficulty of getting the transmission, possibly even the difficulty of getting the diesel backups. But the primary difficulty and delay seems to be actually in getting the compute equipment to run all of these things. And so I just mentioned that, it's going to be years before you could actually fill up all these racks, I think. But I'm still unclear on the basic reason. Firstly, are these data centers, in your opinion, designed to compete with ones built in Singapore or India or with ones in the USA? I mean, are they going to be used for... Why would you build a gigawatt data center like Anthropic? I just noticed they're doing an IPO or getting ready for it, and they make Claude, and they are renting from Elon Musk a data center that's just been built, and they're paying US 1.something billion a month for it. Makes me laugh. Why would those guys want to have a data center in Australia? Is it because we can build one here right now, or what does Australia have? What's our comparative advantage?
Yeah, look, I think Australia has a lot of comparative advantages in terms of the market that these hyperscalers are looking to sell services into is really Asia, Pacific, and the States. And from that perspective, what has Australia got? Number one is we've got a very, very stable economic environment with, I'd say, low sovereign risk. We've got good, strong, reliable power grids. We've got the opportunity to access plentiful renewable energy, and we've got good access to land. And we're also seeing our state governments are starting to be really helpful and supportive to bring this investment into Australia. So there's a lot of pluses for Australia for these hyperscale data centers, David and Giles. And yes, we are competing. We are competing 100% against other locations like Singapore and other countries in Southeast Asia. But they also have resource limitations, which I think Australia can compete with. So it's we should be optimistic about what Australia can do, so long as we can keep the front door open for these hyperscalers to actually have certainty around investment risk. Because if it gets difficult or uncertain, they still have customers to serve. They will move. And then I wanted to touch on a very constructive conversation I had with one of the state governments about how to handle this influx, and it's pretty chaotic the way they're all coming in. How can they take a proper leadership role to start to proactively identify locations on the grid where we can host multiple data centers, where the land is actually available and zoned appropriately? It will minimise impact on the community. This does have access to renewable energy. So I think what I'm starting to see in certain states in Australia is once they're getting organised and coordinated to guide the investment in, I think it's really going to hopefully keep the investment flowing, keep it positive for our customers.
So can I just sort of go back to sort of what my big sort of fear was, or big question about the data centers was, and there's this fear about, will data centers, you raised the question about will they break the grid? Well, they probably won't, because AEMO will ensure they won't. But will they facilitate Australia's green energy transition, which seems to be stalled, or will they end up being another sort of barrier because they just want to get built fast and they'll end up sort of being powered by fossil fuels? You've talked about the desire for green electrons, but you've also talked about the opportunities and the need for gas, and they'll all be surrounded by their individual sort of circle of diesel gensets. Hopefully they'll never be switched on. But can we just sort of be assured that the data centers can end up being a good thing for the green energy transition, rather than something that's just going to help stuff it up?
Well, I see AEMO revised their forecast data centre demand in Australia up by 50% about a month ago. And I think what they're forecasting, and David, you'll probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but 2035, I think we're looking at 12.5% of Australia's energy will be consumed by data centres. So, and I think that's right, and it may be more. but the amount of investment behind these data centres is phenomenal, and they will invest in new generation, and my hope and expectation is renewable generation to support our energy transition. So I can see it only being a good thing so long as it's properly orchestrated. And I think the orchestrator of how they come in and what their expectations are is a role the federal and state governments need to play. And it was really pleasing to see the federal government recently issued their basically the expectations of data centre and AI infrastructure development in Australia. And they just put out there at the moment as expectations, and I guess the language that went with it was where the federal and state governments will prioritise data centre investments that's aligned to these expectations. And the 5 expectations are, number one, data sovereignty and national security, enabling the energy transition, water sustainability, building Australian skills and workforce, and also enabling innovation, R&D, and building local capability. So those 5 expectations have been put out there now by the federal government, and the energy ministers, I believe, met recently to talk about how they can bring those into state-based expectations and possibly legislation. So we're seeing some really strong, good proactivity from our government to keep them focused on what Australia needs and how we can benefit from this investment.
So we discussed this at the conference very briefly, this like first contact type of thing, and the corollary that no strategy survives first contact. But when I look in the United States and you look at the survey evidence in a place like Virginia, where there's been a lot of data centres built, support for them publicly has dropped a lot. There are complaints about noise, about water availability from time, about the lack of consultation. The usual sort of complaints that anyone that's worked in the renewable energy business, that the people who were near where the data centres are just not properly taken into it. I suppose it doesn't matter so much in Sydney. Well, there's less. It's not like a rural constituency. Most of these data centres probably will be built in major Sydney metropolises. But then what also seems to be happening in the United States is it's become a kind of a national us and them kind of thing because of the perception, rightly or wrongly, that data centres are pushing up electricity prices. And I think that was in the PJM market, where the capacity prices went up hugely, even though the data industry later came back and explained it wasn't really the data centre industry. Of course, they explained that. Nevertheless, that perception's grown, and it's caused a real issue. How do you think about how Australia should proceed so that we can get the benefits without pissing so many people off, if people do have to be pissed off?
Well, look, David, I mean, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from what's been evolving in the States from a community and social license perspective for data centres, and take a different approach here in Australia. And I think it's, like I said, it's good to see our federal and state governments being proactive in terms of setting out their stall early. If you want to be successful here and you want us to prioritise your investments, then here's what we need you to do. So I think that's really a very positive thing for Australia, and I'm very optimistic that it'll drive a different outcome, particularly if we're proactively identifying locations within our country where we think that the power is there, the land is there, and it's suitably zoned. We believe that it's in a location that it's not going to have an impact on local communities if they're expected to solve for the energy transition solution as part of their planning permit or regulatory process. I think that if we commit to that course of action, which I'm seeing has been started by the federal government, I think that we'll do our best to make this a positive investment in Australia. That's how I see it, David and Giles. It's about learning those lessons and actually showing some leadership and guiding these data centres in the right way.
Well, it sounds like a terrific opportunity to have leadership shown, I guess. This is obviously going to be quite dramatic. It could be, as you say, very, very beneficial. It could be, as some people fear, a complete, very frustrating and very disappointing. But I was going to use another word, but I better not, because this is a family program. Look, David, I don't know whether I've got any other questions.
Well, I will ask just about, you're working on, grid connection processes for wind and solar farms aren't always, some of those developers tell me that doesn't always go as fast as they would like. You mentioned that there's the grid inquiries are swamping AEMO, which is very reminiscent of what happened when the, can I use the word, cowboys started on the solar farms in particular, and everyone with a farm that was near a transmission line wanted to sell their land. What do you think, I suppose, a question I would ask of AEMO's sort of data centre build-out sort of projections? Do you think, would you want to be lifting them or lowering them? Have you thought about it? I mean, your 3 gigawatts, when would you expect it? I'm just asking for some, to speculate again on what sort of pace this is going to go at.
I think we just have to be adaptable, David, as we start to see what's real and what's not, and what can be connected and what can't be connected. I think it's all I can say is there's a lot of really good collaboration happening between AEMO, VicGrid, AEMC through working groups, and including the hyperscalers and their advisors to work out what's real and what's not when it needs to come. So I just think it's one of these very, very rapidly evolving industries that we just have to just keep a watch on and just keep communicating, keep coordinating. So a lot of my role these days is not so much power engineering, it's more just bringing the right people together across that stakeholder group to make sure we're understanding each other and moving forward. And I think that's really, I know it's not a hard and fast answer, but
No, it's what I expected.
Yeah.
And like a 1 gigawatt data center might be like a 1 gigawatt wind farm. You might build it in 4 250 megawatt stages or something like that. Is that the way it would go? Or
Yeah, look, typically when we're going in for grid capacity as part of an inquiry or an application, we're looking at what the ultimate build out could be, and we're normally providing an input to AEMO is what that ramp up could be over years. And typically for 1,000 megawatt data center, we're seeing ramp ups anywhere between sort of 5 to 10 years, sometimes longer. That's all just the best information that that we can provide AEMO at the time. The real trick is, once they secure the capacity, secure the site, and start to build, how will, let's call it global demand or regional demand of compute, actually drive that build out? And that's a real challenge that AEMO are wrestling with at the moment, right? Because all they're seeing in the applications is what the ultimate ask is. It's almost like the dream, and managing that reality of grid capacity across all of the different data centers that all have connected data centers is going to be tricky.
If you're HMC, it might be the nightmare rather than the dream. But I don't want to go into that too much. But I do want to ask again, my interpretation when you build, most of the data centers in Australia have been built for cloud computing. There've just been some business that essentially, like the government, for instance, that wants someone else to manage all their compute for them. That's the simplest case I can put, CDC or something like that. But what you're suggesting to me is that when hyperscalers want to build data centers to do AI inference and training.
Yeah, that seems to be the bulk of the activity we're seeing in Australia at the moment is AI inferencing and training. David, correct?
And that's good. Well, Keith, I'm sure there is, when Giles and I actually learn some more, enough to ask some interesting questions, we'd love to come back to you. I really appreciated this interview. I think speaking on behalf of Giles on this introduction to this incredible topic, really, because we're moving from something very exciting happening in supply to something very exciting potentially happening in demand, probably faster than the average person in the street realises. There was a story in the Sydney Morning Herald about someone wanting to build a 40 megawatt data centre at Lane Cove. That made the front page of the Herald, but we haven't seen anything yet, have we?
Thank you very much, Keith. Really appreciate you coming on to the Energy Insiders podcast, and good luck, and we look forward to an update sometime soon.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you both.
And that was Keith Middleton, the founder of the Middleton Group, now part of the Fife Group. And we'll be back to talk about that interview and some news of the week after this message.
Australian Energy Week is taking place in Melbourne, June 9th to 12th. With the free Expo Pass, you can walk the expo floor, see live demos, and catch 12 plus hours of expert sessions on the Insight stage, all included with your complimentary pass. The expo brings generators, networks, retailers, renewables developers, and BESS specialists all under one roof, showcasing the technologies and solutions driving the energy transition forward. Whether you're sourcing new suppliers, evaluating emerging technologies, or simply staying ahead of a rapidly shifting industry, The expo gives you direct access to the people and products shaping the future of energy in Australia. To get your free expo pass, visit www.energyweek.com.au/visit-the-expo.
You are back with Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. David, that's pretty interesting, actually, from Keith. Some really interesting perspectives on what's required of data centres for the grid. And from the grid perspective, at least AEMO and grid operators, and also from the governments in terms of being good corporate citizens and likely helping with the transition and not stuffing up the grid for everybody else and not resulting in more emissions. Hopefully that comes to pass.
Giles, speaking as an investment banking analyst, what immediately catches my eye is the scale and speed of the investment. We don't exactly know about the speed, but being swamped with inquiries, and they're actively working, like spending money on 3 gigawatts of connection studies, which are probably a fair way through. I'd suggest. It's really, I actually forget the number, but, in the United States for one of these data centers, you could spend $40 or $50 million, pretty much a megawatt of capacity. So we're talking really large-scale investment dollars going into Western Sydney probably and into, is it Deer Park in Melbourne? And that's going to mean a lot for those areas. It's going to mean a lot for Australia and happening much quicker than we think. And as you alluded to, it seems to be this wonderful opportunity to put the data centres in the same room with some of these very slow-moving wind developers and shake their heads together and tell them both to get on with it.
Look, exactly. Look, the governments in Australia and around the world have had difficulty saying no to trillion-dollar industries, and I'm thinking here of the car industry and the fossil fuel industry and the transport industry and things like that. We're about to have trillion-dollar companies with a couple of the listings and the IPOs that are happening at the moment. The government's going to be able to say no to a trillion-dollar company that wants to do stuff.
Depends how much money they've got, Giles.
$1 trillion.
Yes. Well, this is not the podcast to be talking about that. But if you were to look at the Musk one, what happens is you list about 5% of the company. And get some of your mates and other people to invest the shares for that amount, and the business is not actually worth what the resulting sum says it is. It's like if you put $1 in, you can make it worth $1 billion if you value it.
No,
that
look,
way.
That's absolutely true. No, the question wasn't really about whether they're worth $1 trillion or not. The question was that these are powerful companies. They're going to be big companies. They're going to pretend they rule the world or own the world. So it's just a matter of, it was kind of a rhetorical question about whether governments would sort of stand up and hold them to account and say no if needed, because I think no if is going to be needed on some occasions, particularly if these guys want to do what they do in the US and basically sort of bring a whole bunch of gas generators and just sort of stuff our sort of emissions profile and our generation switch. So
it's not just gas. I mean, if you look at these guys, they've got so much money. They're funding part of the small modular reactor stories. Personally, I'm not buying a data center that depends on those, but you might think that actually, if enough money goes into an industry, something will actually pop out the end of it. And I personally think that, look, I agree with almost everything Keith Middleton said there, and that it's a great opportunity for Australia to learn the lessons from overseas and to learn the lessons from our wind and solar energy and do it better.
Well, that's right. And look, and let's we've said many times on this podcast, wind plants and a lot of solar and battery hybrids struggle to get PPAs with buyers. The utilities aren't buying because they show no interest. So if there's a data center that's buying their power, then that'll be a good thing.
Meanwhile, we did actually see a couple of PPAs get announced or projects get the go-ahead this week, today.
Yeah, financial close. Yeah, look, these are probably never in doubt, actually. This is the Smoky Creek and Guthrie's Gap solar and battery projects up in just outside Gladstone. They're always probably going to get built because they've got a long-term contract with Rio Tinto and they're serious about closing the Gladstone coal-fired power generator and powering their smelters and refineries with renewables, solar and batteries being key among them. I guess what's interesting about this is that Edify Energy, reasonably successful, very successful Australian developer, recently got sold to La Caisse, which is a Quebec-based investment group. And they've rattled the tin and got 14 domestic and industrial institutions in Australia, and sort of domestic and international institutions, and provided a sort of what they're describing as a unique sort of funding platform with $3.5 billion. And look, Edify Energy has obviously got about 5 or 6 projects lined up to get funded in this way, but it is a good moment, I think, for the green energy transition to sort of note that things can get financed, they can get contracts, and they can get built.
Even a solar project in Queensland can get...
Well, it's a solar and battery hybrid project. Let's be very clear about that. So look, that's interesting. So I think that's a powerful thing. We also saw the New South Wales government formally open its tenders.
2.5 gigs.
It's the biggest... Yeah, it's biggest ever renewable generation tender. So they suspended their tenders for a while because the capacity investment scheme kind of took centre stage, and New South Wales has pretty much filled its quota under that scheme. So it's rolling out its own, going back to its own tenders because it still needs more capacity to replace its coal-fired generators. And as we've mentioned on this podcast many times, it's still only got one wind farm being built at the moment, Andrew Forrest Ngula wind project. So it's seeking 2.5 gigawatts and a special interest on wind, and it's got a new Altesa specifically designed for solar and battery hybrids, but I think also allows for wind and battery hybrids. So that's kind of what it kind of sort of says, we're looking for power that can be delivered when the sun's not shining. So that is interesting enough. And there's also 12 gigawatt hours of large, long duration storage, which is also interesting because the scale of that suggests that they'll get a whole bunch of 8-hour batteries, but obviously looking for something else to have that gigawatt hour capacity. So possibly another pumped hydro project will find its way in, and it'll be interesting to see which one that is.
Yes. Not that it'll ever get built, but the concept's fine.
The concept's fine. Yes. So look, that's good, and I suspect that sometime the next week we're going to get the results of the last CIS generation tender and long duration storage tender. That was actually
we're still having those, are we?
November. We're still having those. Yes.
Why are we having them?
Because they will one day work, David, because all the data centres are coming along and we'll want to write contracts with them, and then the wind and solar projects will be offered them special rates because they've got the downside mitigated by the underwriting agreement struck under the CIS, and we'll all live happily ever after.
Oh, that could be. I won't say any more than that. I just hope we do get some of these projects progressing, and even in Victoria, we've had Yungilla going ahead in New South Wales, and we've got the Warracknabeal, or how do you say that down there in Victoria? It made a progress on its environmental status, but there's a long way between environmental status and raising a couple of $1 billion, isn't there?
Well, there is, yeah, but this is West Wind, which is behind it, who are pretty good operators. There's been a lot of protests against that. I have no idea how you pronounce it properly. You have to ask a local farmer. We've actually got a really interesting story being published later on this week. Probably by the time this podcast is broadcast, it's probably going to be there, just about some of the misinformation and how it sort of seeps into mainstream media. I'm not going to comment on too much, David, but we just seem to be seeing another burst of activity of sort of disinformation, misinformation, just numbers just thrown around willy-nilly and getting amplified all over the place. And I know you didn't want to talk about it, but Australia did sign a very important climate change or agree to a UN resolution about holding countries to account for climate actions and addressing climate change. And meanwhile, you've got Angus Taylor at the Energy Producers Conference in Adelaide, sort of saying, it's a bare knuckle fight, and urging the fossil fuel industry.
Yes, he's bringing bare knuckles, and everyone else is bringing shotguns. I don't know who's going to win, but anyway,
it's ugly. But look, I do mention that because we don't like to amplify this, but Jesus Christ, the polls are a bit frightening about you don't know who's going to lead the opposition in the future. But it does seem to be combined. I actually think that the battery storage, I think the home batteries, I think the rooftop solar, I think the solar battery hybrids, And the uptake of EVs, I think, is just really...
Look, Giles, the
giving
strategy's working.
The fossil fuel industry... Yeah, it's exactly. And it's giving the fossil fuel industry the shits. And so they're just sort of fighting even stronger and getting applauded by the likes of Angus Taylor to fight even harder and get the bare knuckles out. And
the strategy's working. As I've mentioned several times, in addition to the things you mentioned about the EV pickup, the really good piece of evidence that everyone struggles against, that actually power prices are lower this year. Batteries really do work and have pushed gas out of the system. That's been proved. You and I have been talking about that for years, and the evidence for that's extremely strong. The transmission is actually being built in most regions at the moment. I think Project Energy Connect New South Wales, it won't be out that long before it actually enters the system. You know, there's actually a lot of big wins and smaller wins coming along, and that's the evidence that we really need. When you talk about the disinformation, you might remember that Steve Bannon, I don't want to talk too long on this.
Flood the zone.
Flood the zone. That's the strategy. Just keep pushing out endless conspiracies and bullshit and stuff like that, and keep everyone so busy we forget to focus on the underlying facts. But one thing you can rely on here at ITK and at Energy Insiders and at Renew Economy is we just focus on what's actually happening. We don't get distracted. We look at the progress of the transition, and when it's going a bit slow, we jump up and down, and we hand out some bouquets as well, don't we, Giles?
Thank you, David, for saying that. I really appreciate that. It's well summed up. I'm going to bring it into a podcast on this very positive and uplifting and affirming note. Thank you very much to... before I say thank you, I'd just like to point out we've got some other podcasts on our network. Solar Insiders, they've got a really interesting interview with Francis Verboom from Rewiring Australia, talking about some of the issues on the same lines. The Switched on Australia podcast has had an interview with Danny Alexander from the University of New South Wales. That's also really interesting about we've got a lot of solar, got a lot of batteries, got a lot of EVs, got a lot of devices, but they're still not talking to each other. So that's an important one. And there's also another of the Driven podcast focusing on EVs, and this is about the extraordinary data that's coming out from the International Energy Agency, who were never very sort of quick to be uplifting on the scale of the clean energy industry, but some of the data they've got out is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and you know, of course, I publish on my website, Giles. I update every couple of months the IEA data on renewable energy by country. And, you know, you can see the progress in every country, but it's so, to me, we've been living this so long, it's hardly worth repeating anymore. And I was going to say something else very interesting. I think another topic we need to pick up on now that EVs are actually becoming a real thing is the EV to the home, and actually really see where that's going and where it might go in a few years, and to see whether it can take over from the home battery side of things, which is still exploding at over 400,000. The batteries aren't exploding, but what are we up to? Over 10 gigawatt hours now?
11.2 gigawatt hours. Chris Bowen actually said last weekend that we'd gone over 400,000 installations, which suggests that in the last month, I think they're running at about 20,000 a week or something, or 2,000 a day or something like that. It was just quite extraordinary, the rate of increase. So even with the rebate changes, it continues to roll out quicker than many people expected. So it
was a bold strategy. And the government's going to get a fairly quick payoff for it. Who would ever have guessed they could? You know, I keep looking at all this money that's going into truck charging around the world. But anyway, Giles, we've said a lot already this week. There's a heck of a lot to really digest on this data centre story, which is genuinely big and exciting. Let's sign off, shall we?
I want to thank Keith Middleton from Middleton Associates of the Fife Group now for joining us. Thanks, of course, to our sponsors. And thanks to everyone listening out there. And we'll be back with another episode of the Energy Insiders podcast next week. Bye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solid design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.